People like to overcome a challenge. There's an inherent satisfaction behind it, a sense of pride. This is the attraction to difficult games, and a group of them that come to mind are the Soulsborne titles and those like it. Their punishing style of gameplay can be a slog to get through, killing you time after time. I've actually only played Bloodborne out of these, and while I loved it, something I noticed was the difficulty was not quite what people told me. It's a hard game, don't get me wrong, but in my experience, a lot of that difficulty, that punishment, is a result of trial and error. Brand new area, brand new enemy, brand new way to die before you knew it existed. I'm not saying that means the difficulty is only from the unknown. These games definitely require you to be capable, otherwise a boss wouldn't kill you over and over. But when I was told of its difficulty, I expected that to be from a complex combat system. In reality, it's quite simple: attacking, back off while they attack, attack again. Positioning is important, particularly for bosses, and being consistently clean is the difficult part, but once you know an enemy's moveset, the difficulty does significantly decrease. Sekiro is where this formula differs. In Sekiro, you still have your opportunities to simply avoid an enemy's attacks. However, the posture mechanic forces you to more properly engage an enemy since whittling down health is less effective. There is still a similar new enemy, new way to die sort of idea, but it's tempered. The same can be said about the ease and difficulty once you know what an enemy does. Rather than just attacking while they're open, you have to properly defend their attacks to lower their posture, leading to a death blow. This involves dodging and attacking, parrying, Makiri countering, jumping, or just blocking. Certain enemies have different health thresholds that when reached, their maximum posture lowers, making it easier to keep their posture level low. Still, most non-basic enemies are killed by maximizing posture rather than emptying health, making the act of evasion less useful. Through all this, the combat itself acts as more of a challenging trial than at least Bloodborne and the other Souls games from what I've witnessed. That said, you can get away with simply blocking rather than the more difficult act of parrying, other than for perilous attacks which require a specific reaction other than blocking. Blocking attacks will also cause you to take posture damage, so you can't do it indefinitely without recovering, but it is still a reliable option. That is, unless you want to experience the true test of combat. After beating Sekiro, you can opt to either continue your game or start a new game plus. In the latter, you'll start with an item called Kuro's Charm. When you reach the Divine Heir, you'll have the choice to give it back to him. If you choose to do so, you'll receive both posture and health damage when you block an attack. Blocking does mitigate some of the damage of course, but damage is already raised from being a new game plus. I don't want to overstate it, but this drastically changes how you have to operate. It became quickly apparent to me how much I relied on blocking, especially with minor enemies. If you aren't properly parrying, you'll much more easily accrue damage. This means you're required to react more quickly, particularly when you're forced to fight groups of enemies. You don't just have to be more reactive, you have to be more aggressive. Sure, you can parry everything coming at you, which for basic enemies will almost always empty their posture eventually, but if there are too many, their attacks may become overwhelmingly relentless. Instead, you look for a clearing to engage an enemy and cut them down one by one. In New Game Plus, you also do quite a lot of damage, so minor enemies will die quickly. This enforces the dueling nature of the game and means any enemy can theoretically cause some issues no matter what point of the game you're at. Some enemies and bosses can deliver a flurry of attacks in sequence, and mitigating as much damage as possible requires tight reaction time. This can become sort of a rhythm, the combination of attacks, blocks, parries, and dodges. In my opinion, this becomes a bigger test of skill in regards to difficulty than what I experienced in Bloodborne. It relies less on avoiding attacks and more properly timing your defense and mixing in offense. In other words, in Bloodborne your defense was simply avoiding. Both games involve mixing defense and offense, but your defense is much more critical in Sekiro. This isn't to say Bloodborne is a worse game for it, but Sekiro is definitely preferable in my opinion. Mind you, it's not without its flaws. I wish it had a bigger variety of offensive weaponry, or at least made the prosthetic tools more effective as a weapon, the same way enemies have attacks that you have to react to differently. As well, parrying in either a first or subsequent playthrough does add a bit of posture damage, which can feel a bit like a punishment for playing effectively. Although, it can never be fully broken as long as you parry, and I suppose a reason for it can be that some enemies will attack furiously, and lowering your posture as you parry each attack means you have to be successful throughout the entire combo. Despite this, Sekiro handles back and forth combat brilliantly and establishes a difficulty that results in gripping intense fights with possibly the most satisfying feedback in a game I've ever experienced. Here are some examples. There are still enemies that you can brute force your way through since you do so much damage, but even they at times can provide some resistance. While you're not often at risk of dying to these enemies, especially when they're alone, this mode requires you to be on your toes if you want to mitigate how many gourds you use. There are basic enemies further along the game that will prove even more difficult in this regard as seen here. These aren't too far in the game, so the statement rings true even further than this. Now, these are enemies that you can often stealthily kill or empty their health just as easily as lowering their posture, which I might as well say that emptying someone's health will always result in an empty posture as well. A step up from them are the mini-bosses. Like the 7 Spears fight here, you're required to bide your time parrying his attacks. Since he has low posture, you don't actually have to do a lot of damage to him. You're better suited parrying and using the Makiri counter on his many thrust attacks. There's another good example for a low posture mini-boss, the Ashina Elite in the Castle Dojo. His main attack is a pair of swift vertical strikes. You can sidestep this in attack, but this is a really slow way to win. The most effective way is to parry both strikes, though this is certainly the more difficult option. The low posture though will mean that parrying both only a few times will empty it. As far as parrying subsequent attacks in quick succession, this is probably the hardest in the game, but it only requires 2. A more consistent example, albeit larger gaps between strikes, come from either of the long-arm centipede fights. The fight against Giraffe gives you such a tiny arena that avoiding attacks and hitting once afterward, like I did with Sen'un before I was better at parrying, is impossible. Like the Ashina Elite, parrying his combo a few times will give you a quick death blow. Sounds easy, but the pacing of attacks can be quite tricky to get down. Blocking the whole combo will break your posture and will probably kill you, so this fight can be difficult without the charm. Big bosses are the main focus though. These typically have a higher balance of defense and offense with higher amounts of health and posture, meaning attacking to lower the maximum posture threshold is necessary. They also often have the most advanced movesets in complexity and variety, making defense trickier as you get to understand your opponent more. The first rematch with Genichiro is a great example. It's redundant at this point to go over parrying all of his attacks and how that's useful, you get that by now, but one to make note of is the quick barrage of arrows. He often follows up by rushing you, so not correctly parrying them is going to leave you with a good quarter less of health to deal with. The other reason I bring this up is because it's another attack with a staggered pattern, which are great. Genichiro is a boss with many pauses, allowing you to heal or go on the offensive. This is unlike the Guardian Ape, whose attacks are so punishing that your defense has to be as clean as possible, as you'll often be one-shot if you're hit. Unfortunately, somehow offense is also more important, as his posture is so high that emptying the health is required. There are small attack windows, but you're forced to defend almost immediately after, so caution's advised. This goes for the second phase too, and probably my favorite moment in the entire game, when this decapitated ape picks up both his head and the sword that severed it. Although I consider this the easier phase, it's still an awesome moment worth mentioning. It requires frequent offense in small doses, and goes to show how varied the fights in Sekiro can be just by changing how often you need to defend and how often you need to attack. When I initially began my second playthrough, I gave Kuro his charm and soon regretted it. I was rusty after taking a break and now had to relearn enemies early in the game, and it was proving frustrating. When asking for a way to get it back, a friend advised I keep it off, as once you get it back you can no longer remove it. I'm very glad I did. The fights became so much more meaningful, whether it's as simple as Sheena Guard or a drunken giant. I've yet to finish this run, so I'm sure there will be some frustrating fights down the road, particularly one I'm sure will fill me with hatred. But FromSoft has created an incredible game with a great combat feel, and now all I can do is play and wait for Sekiro 2. As always, I hope you enjoyed my video, this being a more focused attempt at a specific feature rather than a full game critique. If you'd like to talk more, then join my Discord and we can talk about anything. And one last note, as extremely uncomfortable as I am saying this, if you like my content, consider supporting my Patreon. It's a good gauge for how much people might care and would give me some incentive to creating more. But whether you do that or just subscribe, I really appreciate it. Thanks for watching.